taking time for your health. The African American Wellness Watch. Trusted information for us, by us. Dr. Mike Lenore and other experts from around the country and around the world have the latest on how you and your family can get healthy and stay well. It's time for the African American Wellness Watch.
Welcome to today's edition of the Welcome Watch. Our special guest today is Dr. Rahn Bailey. Dr. Bailey is Distinguished Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at LSU University. But not only that, he's the author of several books and has engaged himself in a number of different ways within all communities, but particularly the Black community, serving as the 112th president of the National Medical Association. To get things started, Dr. Bailey, tell us a little bit about your background. What inspired you to go into psychiatry?
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Lenore, for having me. I have opportunity in the past to share with your audience on my experiences and work we're involved in psychiatry, and I've always enjoyed it. So really appreciate being asked back. I'm Rahn Bailey. I'm from Beaumont, Texas. Very happy and proud of that fact. About 100 miles from Houston. I spent much of my first half of my now 30-year career around Houston. Went to med school in Galveston, trained in Houston, and spent about a decade or so providing psychiatric care in the largest county-funded public hospital there, the Harris County Psychiatric Hospital. So I think I was grounded in psychiatry and issues regarding primary care medicine at that hospital, taking care of many of the most challenging medical and psychiatric cases that existed. Also getting training in medical legal co-occurring circumstances. That led me to go and get extra training in forensic psychiatry, but also I think beginning to appreciate the imbalance and disparity in not only access to care for those with brain illnesses, especially mental illnesses, but also provision of optimized and quality-based care. Those perspectives really led me to focus on addressing healthcare disparities within our community, but also within, I think, the overall psychiatric landscape. That's with my background, and that's led me to now chairing psychiatry here at LSU New Orleans with many of the same challenges that we had in Houston earlier in my career.
All right, let's go right to it. I mean, when violence is discussed in America, it's usually discussed in the context of school shootings. What we want to do, though, is to explore violence in the Black community. From your perspective, how does mental health intersect with violence in the Black community?
It's a timely point. I think mental health issues and psychiatric brain morbidity, disease, and the like absolutely intersects with the issue of qualitative violence across the world. In many places where violence numbers are high, I think in urban areas in the U.S., all too often in areas that are African American, where there's a great deal, I think, of such difficulty, much higher than we see in many other places. So a few key issues I think for the audience to be mindful of. First and foremost, many tend to associate violence until the individuals are attempting to gain basic resources. If you're poor, if you don't have access to food, clothing, shelter, there's a quick consideration to move toward use of violence to obtain that which you're missing, the basic needs. Second, though, I think it's also relevant that access to weapons plays a huge role. Even when your basic needs are met, food, clothing, and shelter, if you have access to a weapon, if you have a gun in your proximity, if you keep one on your person regularly, which could be a cultural phenomenon in certain communities, you're a lot more likely to reach for a gun to solve problems that may not have really required that degree, I think, of a violent, even a volatile, terminal type response. So these are issues that I think point out our need to educate our populace, this community and others, find ways using policy to limit access to weapons, especially weapons that can be highly dangerous, the so-called high magazine capacity weapons that shoot like machine guns, although they are handguns, and also work to develop conflict resolution strategies, long-term, but it's very simplistic, that whether our parents teach us that as we're young, whether we get it when we're in school or in other settings, individuals have to learn how to mediate conflict without resorting to the finality of violence.
What are some of the historical perspectives you can give us on why guns have become such a problem in the Black community? Obviously, it's a problem in every community, but it just seems over the past 20, 30 years that African Americans settle arguments with guns.
Well, it's a great point. I wish many of us in my profession and in my discipline had a better answer or a specific or final answer, but I share some suppositions. First and foremost, we do believe that I call it an unfortunate historical legacy in America, that quote unquote, every man had a gun to protect his own self and his land. If you were out in a rural area, there were no law enforcement or police 120 years ago. Your only protection of your family and your wild stock or your farm animals was if you had your own weapon. Unfortunately, that culture has continued over time, and although it probably is misplaced in contemporary times, in urban areas and individual settings of persons, I think, have access to resources. That continuation, I think, it's been part of our problem. This over infatuation with, in my opinion, an acceptance of having a gun to solve your problems. I think it's more than that, though. I definitely think there's been an unfortunate reality in our society of allowing or promulgating more weapons in inner city urban communities. I'm a psychiatrist, so I've read about this. It's not my profession. I can't speak deliberately in regards to how it happens, but the fact that there's a sheer number of guns that's been on the increase in our society is clear. Probably 400 million guns in America now, 350 million people, so more guns than people. So we produce more guns, and then it's easier for them then to flood the streets. I think it's also true that we over-weaponize our society. So if the individuals on the streets have more guns, then law enforcement seeks more funding from state and local and federal resources to have more guns quantitatively and bigger, more powerful guns qualitatively. And then there's an arms race, and then guns have an easier access when they're more available to find their way into the hands of the wrong people. People can hurt you.
When you were growing up, were you ever afraid of getting shot in Beaumont?
Well, I was in Beaumont, Texas, a very different world. Finished high school 40 years ago, so things in the 70s and 80s were different. You knew about guns, but certainly there was not this over infatuation with guns. People weren't regularly trying to access one, and individuals were not regularly discussing using guns to either intimidate or threaten others to get their way, or to use a gun once there had been a prior conflict to end the conflict with what we call qualitative and dynamic violence. We have to end someone's life because you had a non-life threatening conflict, even a verbal conflict earlier. Those issues, I think, are very different. Unfortunately, I, like many people, kind of keep track of my hometown, and the sheer numbers of violence and rates of violence in Beaumont, Texas now are greater and are higher. So we're seeing larger numbers, I think, of violent actions in many places, including more middle-sized or small cities like Beaumont, Texas, not only the larger places like Houston or Dallas or New York or Los Angeles.
Yeah, when I was growing up in Dallas, we had a lot of guns. The difference was it was not reported as a problem because it was in the Black community. But 6 of my classmates were killed between my freshman year and my senior year in high school. And so this has been around for a long time. I think as America's accepted guns as more a kind of a natural thing, I think African Americans kind of eased into this in somewhat the same way. And that if you don't have a gun, it seems to me that it's like a clown show when you do. For instance, they tell you, and my friends I talk to, they say that, well, I got a gun. I said, well, what are you going to do with the gun? They said, well, I'm going to protect my family. Okay, so somebody breaks in your house, the gun is downstairs, and the ammunition is in the garage. And I understand it. Many gun wounds are self-inflicted.
Right. It's a tremendous point, and I think it really is the quintessential point of the difficulty of articulating, I think, an effective argument that might change people's behavior. And I think you set a landscape for really all of the most germane points. First and foremost, many individuals buy a gun out of fear. They think that they're going to have the gun and it's going to be used to protect them and defend them because they're fear of the unknown. Somebody might break in their house. They may go to a place where another person has a gun. People now also often want to have a gun in their car with them so that when they go to the restaurant, if they get into a company, they go to the car to get their gun. So they kind of keep the gun in close proximity. All actions that we find that the data would argue are a lot more likely to lead to results that are not planned, either accidental shootings or discharges, or the wrong person being shot, or the person not being able to access the gun in a timely fashion when they do need it. You make a very good point. Persons very often will keep the ammunition separate from the gun. And if they don't practice and go and get practice shooting or ensure they have a process in place, when there's a conflict and they're under tremendous emotional stress and they're afraid and they're surprised, the ability to access the gun and use it in a way it's intended to protect the life of their family often doesn't happen. Years ago, I was giving a lecture on this topic, and I did some background work, and all the numbers change. I've seen them as little as 20 times, as high as 40 times. You're more likely, if you own a gun in your person, for it to be used for something other than that which you really bought it for. Either it's accidentally shot, or somebody breaks into your house and steals your gun and use it out in the commission of other criminal activity, or they break into your house and take your gun from you and shoot it, or you get it and you haven't practiced in a while, so it backfires or it misfires, or you get it and shoot because you haven't practiced in a while, you miss people. There's a data point that I like to often share with audiences, and I'm not a gun owner or a practice, so I know this is difficult to do, but I would just share a recent data point indicated that for policemen, many of whom have prior military training, and all of which you'd imagine at least regularly, maybe once a month, go to the range to practice. In a particular group of policemen, only 4 out of 5, or 80%, could hit a stationary target at 50 feet. And when that target moved, it dropped to 2 out of 5. And this is the people who are trained and who practice regularly. So imagine the likelihood that somebody who's not trained ever, who doesn't practice, who thinks they have a gun, is going to be able to hit anything at 50 feet. It's very, very
Yeah, that's always bothered me. Why is a brother going to practice a gun in the city? And I think that's why so many people get killed. They never have any practice.
no practice.
I mean, how many people can shoot somebody from a long range? I mean, and then you start scattering stuff. That's one of the reasons I think the morbidity. So I don't know anywhere you can go in Oakland or San Francisco to just be randomly practicing a gun in the middle of a neighborhood.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, there are these so-called shooting ranges, but they cost. They're not free. But I think you make another very salient point. Most people don't think they need to practice. The concept is, and I challenge it, so I think you've given me the medium to talk about this today, but the concept is because you have a gun, you're safer. And I often make the argument that academically, the data would argue that that's not the case. Unless you have the gun that's properly trained, unless you practice regularly, unless you go through these intermittent, once a month spot checks of what you're going to do in a certain situation. And most people, I mean like 99% most, not 51% most, never do all of those things, and some don't do any of those things. You just really are caught off guard when a bad circumstance occurs, and then you're in the middle of a bad situation. Or you think you have a gun, you bring it with you. You have to leave it in a car in a glove box because you go into a restaurant or a library or a mall or an airport, and you can't walk in with your gun. So it's not actually on your person. So this idea that you're safe because you own a gun is just really not based on the facts.
I knew growing up that you couldn't talk about them. You could talk about a lot of things. You couldn't talk about anybody's mama, but nobody got shot for it, like they do now. Tell me how you feel. Your work, you're probably the most experienced in our community on gun violence, and just general community, but certainly in the Black community. What have you been able to do as a result of your research and the kinds of things that you've been doing to change the dynamic in our community? What works?
Well, I think there are 4 things that we're engaged in that I think have potential and at some level are working. I will always start with education. I don't think we can do a good enough job or have enough quantity of educational opportunities on these topics. Literally today, You saw I have my black and gold tie on, so I can't help but mention this is my fraternity's Founders Week. On yesterday, we had church today, but on yesterday we actually had a service project. And part of that project was very similar to in the old days. You'd have a health fair, and in the distant past, that would measure your blood pressure and maybe a diabetes check. I'm very happy that over the course of the last decade or so of my career, now there's also often a depression screening check at health fairs, at a church activity and the like. But now we actually talk about violence prevention, and the promulgation, I think, of violence. So I think that education matters, and you can tell that young people are listening probably because they've already heard more stories and anecdotes about guns and violence that I think are very often incorrect by non-professional persons or settings. So education is one issue. I think the second issue is I think we also discussed the fact that a person is going to have a gun. We push them to get properly trained in the practice. So I mentioned it earlier, but I think that those persons who get a gun very often think that their process has stopped. And I made the point before, I don't think that you're safe only because you have a gun unless you continue to engage in ongoing training and practice. We've not done that very well in our society. There's a lot of discussion about buying a gun and how much it's going to cost or what it can do. Not much about ensuring that persons are engaged in ongoing practice-related activities. That's something that I think our group does, and I think we do it fairly effectively across the full spectrum of activities. I think the third issue that we're involved in as psychiatrists, I'm here at LSU now. I was at Wake Forest before. I was at Meharry before that, as you pointed out. We're doing a much better job teaching our audiences and our patients and families what we know about how to limit risk. So when you discharge somebody from the hospital, one of the first things you do is ensure you talk to the family about eliminating access to potential weapons, guns and knives. You'd be surprised at how often families don't think about that. The person is discharged and come out of the hospital, goes back to them when we're involved. But when they don't go to the hospital and there's no professional involved, but the family knows there may be at some risk, simply taking the guns and the knives out of the home, putting them on the lock and key can go a long way to eliminating when that bad event occurs, somebody going to reach a gun. And the fourth thing we try to do now is we actually talk about situational settings. And this is very important to me. We talk so much about when things are going bad. Often guns are used in a bad way with bad outcomes when things are going good. We're getting to the holiday season right now, whether it's Thanksgiving or the Christmas holidays, whether it's a New Year's, people shoot their guns already, whether it's a birthday party or the 4th of July. Some have a little bit too much beer to drink. They let their guards down. Old issues kind of come back up into play. Somebody had a conflict or a fight with Uncle Johnny or cousin Sue some time ago. Tempers flare, and a person runs and grabs a gun because of easy access to guns. They may go and grab it because they learn to use that to modify and to scare people to talk them down. But and eventually somebody pulls a gun, somebody shoots, and somebody's hurt.
You've been doing this for a very long time. And obviously, your voice is one of the really few authoritative voices on this subject. Now, you're running to lead one of the largest psychiatrist associations in the country. Do you think that general psychiatry recognizes the problems that guns uniquely play in Black communities?
Unfortunately, I don't. I think that that's one reason we have work to do. Our work is cut out for us. I think all too often issues regarding guns and violence are dynamic and interpersonal. And for too many people, even very often professionals, even psychiatrists, I would argue, they don't really resonate until it affects us directly. There's a shooting in our neighborhood, at our child's school, at a grocery store that we actually just kind of walked out of, where we shop regularly. Then these considerations become real. At that point, you see individuals kind of come to life and support programs and want to have an active discussion. You see persons show up for a town hall that in the past thought, well, that was in somebody else's neighborhood. It wasn't really going to bother me or my friends or my family. So I didn't really have much to say about it. So I think you hit a very sensitive but a very important point. That these are issues, I think, for all communities to be thoughtful about and for all professionals to be educated and informed about, so that we'll take it very seriously and discuss it, I think, across the full gamut of individuals we take care of. I like to say that violence has now become the 6th vital sign. I went to med school in Texas. You're from Dallas, I'm from Beaumont. We're Texas guys. Finished Galveston in 1990. We learned about the 4 vital signs of basic medicine: heart rate and blood pressure and pulse and temperature. Some years later, we began to discuss across the country that pain was the fifth vital sign. A doctor should always ask patients about pain. Now I would argue that violence is the sixth vital sign. It's a question asked by every clinician in every visit, because very often you won't find out what's there unless you ask.
All right, Dr. Rahn Bailey, Chief of Psychiatry at LSU, one of the major deans, and I say candidate to lead one of the nation's largest societies. I guess it's the American Psychiatric Association.
Yes.
We thank you for your work. Not too many people engaged in the academic interpretations and analysis of this problem, and you've been way ahead of the game in that. Hopefully, the results you're seeing in New Orleans can be replicated across the country. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Lenore. Thanks for having me.